Okay, so we are going to start here. I think we might have made it past this slide, but I'm going to have us use this slide, go through this slide as well. We might have made it through a few more, but that's all right. All of these slides that are in this package, Fluency and Opportunities to Respond, will be included on the midterm exam. So make sure that whenever you're studying for the midterm exam, you study through these as well. Okay, so accuracy is increased through modeling and opportunities to practice skills with immediate feedback. So that immediate feedback is really critical whenever we're dealing with accuracy, because if not, they might just continue to practice doing it the wrong way and not recognize that they are doing it the wrong way. So these are the reasons why accuracy is important, and we've talked about this a number of times, but accuracy is not sufficient for mastery. Accuracy of a response class and the repertoire of a learner is not sufficient to ensure progress through a curriculum sequence that depends on that response. So if all you have is accuracy, and if you don't have accuracy, you're really in trouble. If all you have is accuracy, that's not sufficient to be able to make progress through that curriculum if knowing that specific skill is required. So if you think about if a student cannot walk, and they're not accurate in walking, then they're not likely going to be able to run very well. Another way I like to think about it is someone, on a bicycle trainer. If the person is not able to, pedal, then they're going to have a really difficult time biking without falling over. Because balancing is a huge skill, I guess. But if they have a hard time pedaling the wheels, they're going to have a really hard time balancing. If they're not accurate in steering, they're going to be running into things if they're also trying to learn how to pedal and do these other things. And the other big thing is that accuracy has a ceiling. So just a statement that I like: in rehearsal, people tend to repeat the whole song again and again, wasting time and vocal endurance. Instead, focus on the one-word interval or rhythm that is causing trouble. Don't ignore it and assume that through repetition, you'll eventually stumble into getting it right. So I just kind of like to think about this quote in regards to, we can't just assume that kids, or we should never think that kids are eventually just going to figure out how to do it and get it right. We have to make sure that they're able to do it right and that they do it right consistently. So fluency is, with accuracy training alone, responding may remain shaky, so we must train students for fluency. How do we promote fluency? We have intervention that improves stimulus control through practice and reinforcement of both accurate and fluent responding. So we're not just reinforcing accuracy, we're not just reinforcing them moving fast and getting through it. We're reinforcing both accuracy and fluent responding. We also want to make sure that we don't allow procedures to slow the student down. So I think we talked about in class when we went over this slide the last time, if having kids do a worksheet versus and having to write the numbers as opposed to just being able to say the numbers. It's a lot faster if they're just saying the numbers, and having to write the numbers down is not slowing them down at all. Whatever we can do to make sure that we are focusing on the skill that we're developing fluency in, as opposed to looking at other skills at the same time, is important. And we're going to assess the rate of accurate responding. So one of the things I like to throw in this as well, so in regards to the intervention, is also providing students with performance feedback. Actually providing performance feedback to students whenever we're looking at accuracy and fluency can often kind of be used as goal setting types of a situation. So, how many do you think you're going to get right this time in a minute? And we can use that as a way of reinforcing behavior as well. Can they beat their goal? And they beat their goal, they can get reinforcement. Sometimes just beating their goal is sufficient enough for reinforcement. So fluency is a fluid combination of accuracy plus speed that characterizes competence performance. Accuracy has a ceiling. It's not sufficient for mastery. Accuracy of a response class in the repertoire of a learner is not sufficient to ensure progress. And only when students can perform at approximately half the proficiency level of a given skill are they most likely to engage in and profit from in practice. So again, we've talked about this before. If they're not at that level, they probably shouldn't be given that homework, that work to be They should not be given that work to do at home by themselves or just left in a class to do that work. You should need that assistance. We also, whenever we have fluency, we are promoting retention, endurance, and the application of performance feedback. I'm sorry, application performance standard, meeting performance standards. Um, Hold on one second. All right. Here's just a little quick joke. So Jake is 5 and learning to read. He points to at a picture in a zoo book and says, "Look, Mama, it's a frickin' elephant." Deep breath. "What did you call it?" "It's a frickin' elephant, Mama. It says so in the picture." So an African elephant. So just kind of fluency, kids being able to get it and say it right. So 2 kids both read all 26 letters. One does it in 18 seconds and one does it in 52 seconds. Which do you think is ready to move on? Are they both ready to move on? If all we're doing is looking at accuracy, we might assume that they are both ready to move on. But if we're doing it correctly and we say, okay, the kid's accurate, now we need to start looking at fluency, then we know that the kid really is not ready to move on yet. So here's another one to sort of, all right. So this next one, I want you to take out a piece of pencil and paper and try to work this for me. All right, so this is a multiplication test. So it's going to be testing your fluency in multiplication. So if you're not ready, pause the thing. If you have pencil and paper out, go ahead and get ready to look at the screen. The texts are going to move by pretty quickly, so you need to be paying attention to it. All right, so which of these is the correct answer? Give yourself a few seconds. All right, so if you would have just seen and knew, the XX is 20 and the LXXX is 80, if I had flashed across 20 times 80, you all would have probably, hopefully, known the answer of it's 1600. But because you did not know that, you might not have remembered that the L is 50. Then you might not have been able to multiply that very quickly or remember, because it's, L, you don't have accuracy in that, or maybe you had accuracy but you lack fluency. And then so the M is worth 1,000 or is 1,000. D is 500 in Roman numerals, and C is 100. So that's how MDC is the correct answer here. All right, so transition from beginner to expert takes the following assumptions. The human mind has a limited capacity to perform difficult tasks. In order to perform difficult tasks, mental effort must be expended, and this effort consumes some of the limited capacity. With continued practice over time, the amount of effort required to perform these tasks becomes less and less. When the amount of effort used in performing a task drops sufficiently, that person can then take on a new task at the same time. All right, so this is why we kind of go back to that information we said, where you have to have accuracy, you have to have fluency in a skill to move through the curriculum. Curriculums ideally build upon themselves. So if the beginning skills are a student still at the accuracy stage of the beginning skills, they cannot build upon those skills because they're still having to think about having to perform those easier tasks with accuracy. So let's think about a few examples. We think of math problem solving. If we ask a kid to read the question or the example, and then they're having a hard time reading because they lack accuracy in reading, then they're going to have a hard time thinking about what operation they have to complete, because whenever they're reading, they are not comprehending what they're reading. They're just focusing on the accuracy of reading the individual words. If we think about a math task, so we are asking them to do a 3-digit by 3-digit multiplication problem, and they're still having a hard time with just single-digit multiplication. They're having to put so much time into just calculating what the single-digit multiplication is. They're likely to make mistakes whenever moving through and having to do the carrying and so forth. The way we're breaking it down into the new multiplication procedures of area, I think it's called area, area multiplication, where you sort of use the boxes, makes it a little bit easier for kids because it just doesn't require as much thinking to get it done. And also, I think it's actually a good procedure. But it doesn't require as much thinking to get it done, and it's sort of the steps are broken down, and then after they're broken down, we'll add. I'll try to remember to show you all in class if you haven't seen how this is done now, exactly how to do that and why it breaks it down and might make it easier for kids. But at some point, they're going to have to do the multiplication where they're just doing it where you're carrying over one number up on top of the next. If a kid lacks the accuracy or just only has accuracy in those basic skills, developing greater fluency or developing fluency in the entire task is going to be really difficult, and they're going to struggle a good bit. So the reading process requires two tasks. It requires recognizing the printed word, which is decoding, and then constructing meaning from the words that students decode. If a student is having difficulty or is not fluent in this decoding part, that's where all their mental effort is going. If all their mental effort is going to decoding, then they're going to have a great time constructing meaning from the words that they're trying to decode. Likewise, if they're having difficulty with the vocabulary that makes up the words, they're also going to have difficulty comprehending it because they're going to be having to focus on coming up with the meaning of each of those words. Whenever I say the word wall, for instance, you all don't have to think about, well, what is that? And try to think of different examples. You just know what a wall is. You're familiar with that. You have fluency in that vocabulary word. If I were to give you other types of words, accuracy, fluency, generalization, you might have greater difficulty with it because you actually have to think about what those different components are. So only whenever we develop fluency can we start integrating that information, or does it make it easier for us to integrate that information with new information, and piling that new information on to previously learned fluent mastered material makes life a lot easier for people and increases the probability that they will continue to learn at an appropriate rate. Generalization occurs when the student is able to respond to a discriminative stimulus accurately and fluently without assistance on a task that varies from that which was directly taught to the student. The student is able to apply previously learned skills to new situations. So some just really easy examples of this might be as if, hold on. Sorry, really easy example of this might be if we are thinking about, we teach students how to do multiplication vertically, and then after that we are wanting them to do it horizontally. Some kids amazingly have difficult time doing that because we haven't promoted generalization. Likewise, using different fonts can really mess kids up if they've only seen one font their entire life or one font throughout most of their schooling. So there are different things that we can use to promote generalization while promoting fluency. And that just amounts to using different stimuli, exposing them to different stimuli of ways it might look. So if we're teaching kids how to recognize a ball, we shouldn't always use the exact same ball because they would have difficulty with it. At first, whenever we're teaching accuracy and we're doing modeling, those first few times maybe we stick with the same ball, but once they start getting that, then we can start adding new balls in. So you can start promoting and thinking about generalization as early as whenever you're focusing and teaching accuracy, or your instruction is focused on accuracy. You can start then. As we've talked about before, you always should be programming and thinking about generalization. Generalization is not something that we start thinking about. when we get to wanting a student to be generalizing across materials. So how do we promote generalization? First, we establish stimulus control. So stimulus control is a basic behavioral process that governs academic responding. So the response comes under control of a discriminant stimulus through differential reinforcement. So we've talked about this in our first class. You know, whenever you see the word differential, if you say different, you don't reinforce that behavior. I actually have a hard, or I actually get frustrated whenever kids are reading and they make small mistakes. Like, so they would read the word different here instead of differential, and someone doesn't correct them. If we don't correct them, then they're not going to learn how to do it the correct way. We have to make sure kids are engaging in the correct behavior. Otherwise, that behavior might be reinforced. So we reinforce, a behavior gets reinforced that should not, and the student develops the skill incorrectly. What I was trying to say. So responses come under control of a discriminant stimulus through differential reinforcement. So you're reinforcing the correct behaviors, but behaviors that are not correct, you do not reinforce. Effective teaching is responsive to each student's responses, how those responses change over time, and training students when the response is appropriate, inappropriate, or needs modification. So responses when dealing with basic skills are generally limited to only one response being correct, right? So if I say what's 8 plus 5, it's always going to be equal to 13. It's never going to be equal to 15. Likewise, 8 times 5 is always going to be equal to 40. It's never going to be equal to 13. Whenever we're teaching a kid these skills, you know, we would have to show them and point out that in the first 8 plus 5, the plus symbol is different from the multiplication symbol, even though those symbols look pretty close to each other. So we have to teach kids to discriminate. We would not reinforce the behavior of 8 plus 5 is equal to 13. I'm sorry, we would not reinforce the behavior of 8 plus 5 is equal to 15, nor would we reinforce the behavior of 8 plus 5 is equal to 40. We're only going to reinforce the correct behavior of 8 plus 5 is equal to 13. So variety in responses come later when we are applying basic skills to more complex stimuli. So in the top example here, Mark has 8 apples and John has 5. How many do they have all together? The answer obviously is 13. But then down at the bottom, Mark has 8 cars, Peter has 5 cars, and Sue has 4 vans. How many cars do they have all together? So in this one, we are, again, the answer is 13, correct? 8 plus 5 is equal to 13. In the first example, they would just be taught, okay, you see numbers and you're going to be adding those numbers. But in that bottom one, we're having to make sure that they're really paying attention to what type of things are being added up here. And kids are having to learn to differentiate when information is being provided that is unnecessary, or yeah, I guess unnecessary is probably the best word here. So this bottom one, we're requiring them to engage in different skills than the top one because they're having to recognize information that is not necessary or not useful for answering that question. As I said before, we have to program for generalization. It's not just going to occur automatically. And we also don't start programming for it whenever we're ready for it to occur or we're ready to test it. We start programming and thinking about it from the onset of our intervention. So it's not necessary to treat generalization as a separate step, but it's important to recognize it as a separate component, as interventions need to be developed to produce more robust outcomes. Intervention that we use, and we provide opportunities for students to practice skills across a variety of contexts. So we're going to have kids read materials or respond to stimuli written in different fonts, written in different sizes. If you're teaching kids to blend letter sounds, you're not always going to have them blend the same exact letter sounds. It's not always going to be b, at, right? If we were just to get them all the stimuli, the only stimuli we ever presented was the letters B, A, and T, they would learn that, but they might not, if we gave them CAT, they might not be able to do it. So we would introduce variation in that. We would do, of course, CUT. Maybe we'd only do 2 letters. We're going to be introducing 4 letters. Eventually, once they start getting the individual letter sounds, and we're going to start doing with digraphs. Whenever we have 2 letter sounds that the th, they make th. So th, bath. We also would teach students to both not only blend but segment words is another way that we promote generalization of these skills whenever teaching kids to learn how to read and use phonics. So the way we assess is we assess accuracy and fluency in responding to stimulus across a variety of contexts and materials. Okay, that was for before. All right, so to correctly develop stimulus control, all necessary elements of the stimulus must be present for the student. So the stimuli need to be made salient through modeling, prompting, correcting, and reinforcing the correct responses. So thus, if instructional material is not correctly chosen, the development of stimulus control will be weak. So we're having to make sure that whenever we are presenting students with the stimuli that we want them to respond to is salient. So it's very clear what stimuli we're asking them to respond to. I've given the example before of seeing the apple on the walls in classes, and teachers using that apple to encourage or increase the likelihood that students are saying the sound ah whenever they see a. But we have to make sure that they are responding to the letter and not responding to the apple. So we're always making sure that the stimuli that they are responding to is the one that they are going to need to respond to in other situations. To promote generalization, the task must contain recognizable forms of the trained stimuli. If irrelevant stimuli hinder generalization, stimulus control has yet to be established. Okay. At the same time, students need to have the prerequisite skills required in the generalized setting. So this is not going to apply today because we started really early, but look at this text at the bottom and ask yourself, could you read this text? Most of you can't. Surprisingly, some people are able to read it pretty easily. I'm not sure how, but they are. Oops, let me go back. I'm trying to find in my notes what exactly that stands for because I'm actually forgetting now. So it says those who can read this get to leave 10 minutes early. But you all, even though, so these are letters and you all know how to read, but because you've never learned this font, you are unable to read these words. So most of you probably didn't recognize that this, for instance, is an S and this is an H because we've never been taught this font. Even though we can read, we have the other basic components because we don't have those fonts. We can't recognize those skills. We're not able to generalize our reading skills and our blending skills to this sentence because we don't have we don't not know those individual letter sounds. They do not approximate this S. So we're not able to make that large generalization. So in the article Daly, Martins, Barnett, Witt, and Olson, 2007, you all will need to reread that article and probably more than once. Also, you should make sure that you know the tables that are presented in that article. But so some of the statements that they make in there that I guess find important, I want you to know about is, so how do we improve the quality of instructional materials? How do we improve the quality of practice time? And how do we arrange contingencies to support generalization? So how do we improve the quality of instructional materials? Well, we have to think about generalization. So we think about making sure that the antecedents are unambiguous. One of the ways we do that is direct instruction. If you look at direct instruction, we'll be talking about that a little bit later, but they make sure that kids are very aware of the stimuli to which they are responding to. whenever we are giving directions when doing direct instruction. There's no ambiguity in regards to what response we want students to provide to us. Students know what they're going to say. They know when they're going to have to say it. So all kind of antecedents that are preceding the response that we want from students are unambiguous. We make sure that the way that teachers are saying the statements every time is consistent. And that's one of the reasons why within direct instruction, what teachers say is actually written out for them. The reason we make it written out for them is because we want them saying it the same time, same exact way every time, to make sure that everything is very clear for the students. We also have to make sure that antecedents lead to reinforcement, right? So whenever we give them, we point something out that they're going to know that if they engage in the next behavior, they respond correctly to the stimuli, it's going to lead to reinforcement. So that we have to consider the context in which instructional demands are being placed. So we talked about, or Daly talks a little bit, but he doesn't go into great detail about it regarding whether we should be teaching words in isolation or we should be teaching them in natural context. Some students can get it in natural context because whenever they are seeing those words, uh, they don't require a huge number of repetitions with words to be able to make those words part of their sight vocabulary. But other students need a number of repetitions for it to become part of their sight vocabulary. And for those students, oftentimes we're having to take those words out of isolation. Whenever reading passages or reading text, some students are able to use the contextual information to be able to read the words, the unknown words correctly. Um, we actually, while that's good that students are able to do that, we actually, if we're wanting kids to pick up new vocabulary, pick up new sight words, we're actually not hoping that that's the way that they are getting the words correct. We want the reason that they are reading words correctly, to be that they are recognizing the letters that make up those words, and they're able to blend those letter sounds together. Surprisingly, we would think that kids who are skilled readers would be using contextual clues more so than kids who are less skilled readers and might be having difficulty with comprehending. It's actually the opposite. Kids who are skilled readers, whenever they come across new words, are less likely to use the context clues than kids who are unskilled readers. Kids who are skilled readers, they're going to, first of all, use their decoding skills to read those new words. Unskilled readers, because they have a really difficult time with decoding and blending, they're going to try to use the context clues in order to be able to get those words correct. Using those context clues, unfortunately, because they might have misread other words, often produces for them the incorrect word, but they then just tend to go on anyway. So we have to evaluate the student we're working with, think about the student we're working with, and if a student is having difficulty developing fluent reading skills, we need to test whether or not this student is more likely to read words or learn words, develop fluency with new words whenever those words are taught in isolation or whenever they're taught in the natural context. If we teach them in isolation, we then have to make sure that they're also able to use them whenever they're in context. It's kind of amazing to me how you can teach a set of sight words and kids are able to get them accurately and fluently, but then you put those same sight words into text and then students end up struggling using it. Potentially the reason for that is because whenever we teach them in sight words, maybe that's forcing them to use, they're being forced to decode the words, but then whenever we put it in whenever they're in isolation, they're forced to decode the words, and they can kind of do it. And now, after practicing those sight words when on flashcards, they kind of have in their working memory what words make up this group of sight word cards. But then, when we put those same words into context, because they typically are using context clues, they get to the words and they make mistakes and they just don't get it correct. So we need to make sure that they are we put those words and have them practice those words in context after they've practiced them in isolation. So practice promotes maintenance, generalization, and application, but we need to make sure that we're using instructionally matched materials. Whenever we say instructionally matched materials, meaning we should not be giving materials that are too difficult for students to do. We shouldn't be giving them materials that are just way too easy, that they have all the knowledge and skills and they're completely fluent and they've just entirely mastered the skills, because if they've entirely mastered the skills, then we're essentially wasting their time. But we also, whenever thinking instructionally matched, we need to think, well, where is their instructional level? Where is their skill level? Are they at the accuracy, fluency stage? And if so, matching the type of instruction we're providing to their specific skill needs. So we can do brief practice sessions with modeling and feedback to students for accuracy. We should be monitoring and graphing progress at all times. And then we need to have pre-established goals to know when we're going to move on to our next skill. So if we set these, then we're not going to be wasting time if we can have pre-established goals and skills. Now, one question might be, how do we develop these pre-established goals and skills, or pre-established goals? One thing that we don't do in the schools that we should do is we should be assessing the fluency of students in older grades, right? So if we're looking at second grade students and they are doing 3-digit by 3-digit addition, 2-digit by 2-digit addition, we should check to see what is their fluency in 1-digit by 1-digit addition. And that's the level of fluency that we should try to bring our younger students to before we start moving on to the next level. So if we were to measure the fluency of students who are able to perform higher level skills with fluency and look at those component skills, and so, okay, so we know, again, let's start over. So we know a kid is able to do 3-digit by 3-digit addition with accuracy and fluency, and they're able to use those skills whenever they're doing word problems. They can do it, without thinking, and they have 100% accuracy. Well, let's measure their fluency in doing 2-digit by 2-digit addition. Now, we're going to make sure we're going to set that whenever we're teaching 2-digit by 2-digit addition to kids, we're going to make sure that they get to that level of fluency before we start teaching them 3-digit by 3-digit addition. Now, maybe it's going to take us a little bit longer to get those kids to 2-digit by 2-digit by 2-digit addition, because we are requiring a higher level of fluency than those 3-digit by 3-digit kids have, because they develop some additional fluency just with the earlier skills along the way. But whenever we go to teach that second group of kids, the 3-digit by 3-digit addition, they're going to move through that so quickly because they are so fluent with the earlier level skills. So we can just kind of think about, that's the way we need to be thinking about our instruction, is that if we develop those basic skills with great levels of fluency to levels that older kids are able to do it in, older kids who are able to do it in who are performing higher level skills, then students will be able to build upon those skills with great ease and be able to move through the curriculum very quickly. So because fluency building occurs gradually and involves a variety of curriculum materials, students are inevitably exposed to both programmed, so differential reading levels and vocabulary across passages. So those just are sort of programmed in the sense that if we have a curriculum, if kids are, we're working on oral reading fluency, so we're having kids do repeated readings of passages. They're not just going to read the same passage over and over 100 times to build fluency. They're going to be reading different passages. So because of that, they're getting, they're being exposed to different readability levels and different vocabulary across those passages. So those are just kind of programmed into the curriculum. But they're also going to be exposed to naturally occurring variations. So interruptions by peers, changes in location that they're having to read in, different reading opportunities. So maybe they are, reading billboards, they're reading poems, they're reading all kinds of different things. And these things are incidental to the planned curriculum. I often whenever doing my research, I get really frustrated that we get placed in the lab and um, we're doing our eye tracking and these kids are having to read passages on the computer, and there ends up being noise in the background, and I get really sort of nervous, annoyed, worried that this is really going to impact my research. But these kids are so accustomed to having noise in the background that it just doesn't disturb them. So these sort of things are occurring naturally in school buildings that cause some variations that promote students to promote generalization across situations, across tasks. Now, I'm not saying with that we shouldn't, be thinking about programming for generalization, which, goes back to that section, the top there, where it says inevitably exposed to both programs. So the teacher, the instructor, whoever it is, needs to be thinking and making sure that we are exposing students to different types of reading materials, that they are being exposed to, you know, um, narrative text, expository text. So narrative text are texts that tell stories. Expository texts are more science-based type stuff, history. So whenever we're training, kids to just do basic reading, we shouldn't just be using all narrative text. We should be exposing them to different types of text throughout the time. With increases in fluency instruction on basic skills, less instruction is needed on more complex skills. So this is just sort of a well-known fact, but unfortunately a fact that somehow is not often accepted in schools. If we could get schools to spend a lot more time on the basic skills, and just drill those basic skills into students, they would be much better off whenever they started getting into the upper grades. The productive practice is provided when students are provided opportunities to make responses to materials controlled by the teacher, and student responses are high in accuracy but low in fluency. So the Daly article talks a good bit, about productive practice, in that whenever we have students practicing materials. Now remember, there's a difference between drill and practice. But whenever we're having students practice materials, we need to make sure that those materials are controlled by the teachers, so the teacher knows what's in there. The teacher recognizes what skills are being taught and practiced at the time. um, and we're getting the kids to practice that stuff until they're very high, and so whenever they're doing that, they're high in accuracy, right? And we're trying to develop fluency in the skills. So practice is kids are high in accuracy but low in fluency, and we're working on them developing that fluency in there. um, so drill, the drill is whenever they also have, they're clearly also high in accuracy, and fluency is kind of fluency is at maybe a middle level, but we have no worry at all about accuracy. So Daly defines practice a little bit different in this setting and in this article than we've defined it in some of the other articles. So in the other articles we talked about, it's really worrying about developing accuracy. But it was never working on accuracy where the kid is um, doing it at only 70 or 80% accuracy. It was the kid has a decent, 80, 90% accuracy. And we're further building that accuracy. In this article, Daly's talking about productive practice where they're accurate, and he's still probably talking only about 90% accuracy and really low in fluency. And with that, you're thinking they're getting it correct. Okay, so the teacher doesn't have to be over their shoulder to make sure that they're getting the answer correct. The kids are having to just really think about it, and whenever they think about it, they're able to get the materials accurate. So they're still working somewhat on accuracy, building fluency, and because of that, they are very, very low in fluency. Whenever we think about drill, they might be in mid-level fluency. There's no question about accuracy. They're just basically 100% accurate, and we are trying to make them extremely fluent, where they're to a point where they're not having to think about what they're doing. So arranging, another thing that Daly talks about is arranging reinforcement to support maintenance and application of basic skills. So consistent use of reinforcement is needed to keep students engaged. And first of all, whenever we are building accuracy, we're providing that reinforcement for the accurate performance. Whenever we're building accuracy, we do not want to provide reinforcement for fluent performance, because then we're going to end up finding kids making a lot of mistakes or possibly making a lot of mistakes. Whenever we're at the accuracy stage, we are reinforcing accurate performance. Later, once they develop the accuracy, then we're going to start reinforcing fluency performance. Whenever we're doing that, we're going to be focusing both on accuracy and fluency, so accuracy and speed. We want to make sure, we're always wanting to make sure that they have the accuracy there. But once we're getting to the fluency stage, we're also focusing on the speed and reinforcing that speed. So research exists suggesting that problem completion is in itself reinforcing, and this is some work done by Skinner at the University of Tennessee. He's also the person who has done the research with the interspersal procedure, where every fourth problem you insert a difficult problem or a more challenging problem. I'm sorry, every fourth problem you insert every fourth problem is an easier problem. So by doing that, kids are moving much faster. They get to those easy problems and they complete the problem. So the rate of reinforcement naturally increases if completing problems is in and of itself reinforcing. We talked about this in class about, whenever you come across a page in your journal articles that you're reading and there's a table there and you're able to move through that really quickly. That ends up being, reinforcing because you just flip through that stuff. And that page ends up being you get reinforced at a faster rate because you feel like you've completed that page. Students prefer rewards for accuracy when they are fluent, and for on-task behavior whenever completing more challenging level materials. So this is some work that was done by Brian Martins. So again, whenever students prefer rewards for accuracy when they are fluent, and for on-task behavior whenever they're completing more challenging behaviors. Because whenever they're fluent, they're not having, they should be getting the accuracy without any problems. So we can reinforce that fast rate of completion. Whenever they are still at an accuracy stage, you don't want to be rewarding fluency because you're promoting them, making them move quicker. But also the kids are struggling, so you're just sort of rewarding them in that instance for the effort that they are engaging in. You're sort of taking, you're still they're still going to want to do it correctly, right? So if you're just rewarding on-task behavior, it's not like it's unlikely kids are just going to be doing the work incorrectly. They still are going to be trying to do it correctly. But you want to be rewarding they seem to prefer being rewarded for on-task behavior. Practice of high fluency behaviors can be maintained through intrinsic motivation. And this just kind of goes into that idea we've talked about before. So I put intrinsic here. I'm not sure if Daly actually puts that in there also, but I continue putting in here because it goes along with what people in the schools say. But it's really, we are getting entertained by it. We are completing the problems and being reinforced by problem completion in and of itself. So we just, we get information whenever we are fluent in skills, and we don't have to engage in very high levels of effort. And whenever we don't have to engage in very high levels of effort, we don't typically require as much reinforcement for the behavior anyway. So these are some tables that they have in the Daly article that I want to make sure that you all pay close attention to and be prepared to. Basically, I might ask you, so why do we examine correct and incorrect responses? And the answer would be to determine whether modeling, prompting, and feedback can be gradually withdrawn or faded. So we're looking at corrects and incorrects. We need to know that they're getting all the corrects done so that we can know that, okay, well, they're getting everything correct. They're making very few incorrects, so we can draw back the modeling that we are providing or the level of prompting that we're providing. So we need to be continually recording this information so that we can know when we can reduce how much modeling, prompting, and feedback we are giving to students. So the way we do this is the number or percentage of corrects and amount of assistance that we are giving to students. So it's not just looking at the number of correct and incorrect students that students are getting, but we're also actually recording how much assistance we're giving to students in order for them to get that information correct. So Daly and them recommend examining rate through fluency probes. So fluency will indicate whether practice is sufficient or whether other forms of assistance may be necessary, right? So if they are still really slow and not getting things correctly, then we need to be providing some other forms of assistance. If they're not making increasing rates of fluency, but they have accuracy, well, then we know maybe we are somehow slowing them. Whenever we are providing them practice, we are slowing them down, or maybe we're not giving them enough practice opportunities, so we need to increase the number of practice opportunities that we are providing them with so that their fluency can increase. So if you are just giving kids three math problems to practice, and that's all you're having them work on, well, you're not going to see very good rates of increases in fluency. We need to be making sure that we're giving them enough practice opportunities to be able to produce increased rates of fluency. Well, how can we do this? Well, we can use curriculum-based measurement and other types of fluency measures. Remember, whenever we're measuring fluency, we need to be giving probes that are measuring the same skills, right? So we can't be measuring a student's fluency in first grade materials one day and third grade materials the next day. We have to make sure that the level of difficulty in the skills that we are measuring stay consistent across time whenever we are plotting those data to see if we're observing gain or if gain in fluency are occurring. It also should be the skills that we are actually training on. So Daly and them list curriculum-based measurement here, but this was prior to some of the concerns that we came up with, that the Chris and others came up with regarding problems with curriculum-based measurement. So whenever we are using curriculum-based measurement, we're probably not going to be using oral reading fluency passages because those are really general outcome measures. If we're doing math facts, we're not going to be measuring, on the CBM probe that we give to students, we're not going to have 4 or 5 different types of math problems on that CBM math worksheet. We're just going to have the one type of math problem that we are training the student in, because otherwise the rates of our increases in fluency are not going to be observed in that material. So we need to be measuring fluency in the skill that we're providing intervention in. And then the other thing that Daly recommends is that we examine maintenance and generalization. So maintenance, after we train the skill, we should regularly go back and assess whether or not if they're still fluent in that skill. And generalization, we can give, probes that are basically assess that skill in similar situations. So maybe we're going to have different types of reading passages that kids are going to be reading. Maybe we present those math problems vertically and horizontally in the situation on the math probe as opposed to just vertically. Okay. So the other thing, another recommendation that Daly makes is to determine whether the instructional materials are appropriate for the student. So we need to examine the instructional materials to ensure that they promote both stimulus control and generalization. So, with promoting stimulus control, we have to make sure that the stimuli there are clear and unambiguous. So the materials make critical features of the instructional task salient for the learner. And then in regards to generalization, the use of the skills has some variety of cross context whenever we are teaching them. So it's not just the same exact thing over and over again, so that we have some programming for generalization. How we do this, we evaluate the clarity of the instructions and the materials and frequency of opportunities to practice and reject materials that contain irrelevant stimuli that distract and or provide unnecessary clues to students and yield too few practice opportunities across a variety of examples. So let's go over this a little bit more. So instruction and materials and frequency of opportunities to practice. So Okay, so the instructions and the materials. Um, teachers, oftentimes the texts that teachers are using do not provide the specific instructions that the teachers are going to be using. So whenever teachers go to instruct on new curriculum, new materials, they really need to be thinking about the words that they're going to be using before giving those instructions. If they provide confusing material to the students, if they have to correct themselves, that's going to make it more difficult for those students who are learning new tasks. We need to be making sure that we are providing the information to the students consistently over and over and over again. Uh, there used to be this idea with math that we show kids a bunch of different ways to do the same type of problem, and then let kids choose which of those ways they might want to do it. Kids don't necessarily and typically don't have the awareness of which way might be the best way for them to do it, or which way they might understand how they're going to do it. They're probably going to look at their neighbor to see how their neighbor's doing it and go about doing it that way. But if a teacher is teaching multiple ways of doing the same problem, that's likely going to confuse some of the kids and is going to decrease the opportunities to respond that kids are getting whenever they're watching her and receiving modeling and going through that problem over in their head. So teachers need to be consistent in their directions and the ways that they are showing and modeling how to perform tasks to students. Um, then, so in materials that don't allow them to do that, we should be rejecting. This kind of talks about that, but we also, we need to make sure that kids are able to differentiate when to use and not to use a skill. So we need to make sure that kids are actually responding to the correct stimuli, and we can do that by asking them questions and asking them, is this an example or is this an example? And making sure they're having some opportunities to reject non-examples of the skill we're teaching them. So we shouldn't just be showing a circle over and over again, or different types of balls. Maybe we show different types of balls, have them respond to that. Once they become proficient at that, then we give some non-examples of balls and make sure they're able to discriminate between examples and non-examples. And then we also need to make sure that the materials we have for students are providing them with sufficient opportunities to practice across a variety of situations. Okay. Next one, 2B, is examining whether student is progressing when the skill is taught in the natural context. So, we have the textbooks for students, but then we should be, coming out of that context and making up some of our own examples, or, bringing them around the school and looking to see whether or not they are able to apply that skill in other situations. A few good examples come up in my head. One, if we're teaching kids word problems and how to add things up, well, then what we could do after we have them do that, maybe then we make a school store and they have to add up the items that they're buying, but they go to more of a real life situation and they're having to do it. Whenever subtraction comes in, well, then we say, okay, you owe $3. All you have is a $5 bill. How much money do I owe you back? So, but we put them in those real life situations and see if they're able to generalize it. Another, I've seen situations where, we teach kids stop signs. We teach, them different types of signs. But whenever they see those real stop signs um, out in the real world, are they able to generalize? Are they able to recognize them? Whenever they see a fire alarm, are they able to recognize what a fire alarm is, not just in a picture, but also whenever it's on a wall? So we wouldn't want them clearly to pull the fire alarm, but we can make sure that they're able to use the skills that we teach them in class within the natural environment. So in order to do that, we really need to define what the natural context for our use of the skill is, and have students practice that whenever we can. Okay. And then the final one here, another recommendation is devote a significant portion of instructional time to practice with sequentially matched materials. So we should not, what this is talking about, it's sort of, again, the importance of the curriculum that the students are being exposed to and that we have for them. We need to make sure that the curriculums we are using build upon themselves and don't just jump from one thing to the next. Now, what's really helpful and is also critical whenever we have these sort of curriculums is that we develop mastery in each of these skills. So before we move on to our next skills. But we need to make sure that the materials are sequentially matched, so they're building upon themselves as opposed to jumping. And we jump to, we finish page 19 and we jump to page 20, and when we get to page 20, um, that essentially all the skills that are being taught are brand new skills. That shouldn't be the case. If we're, the skills that we are moving into should require some of the previously taught skills, and any of the skills that are being taught on page 20, we need to have modeling for those skills. So we should have any new skill needs to have instruction. And if we're teaching skill C, then that means skills A and B are prerequisites. We need to make sure that skills A and B have been previously taught. So kind of why this is a statement we've said repeatedly, maybe not in this exact same way, but we move more rapidly. We have more rapid gains in generalized performance, are more likely, and students will probably require less overall assistance. So when we have the basic skills mastered, we move more quickly through the curriculum. Whenever we have previous skills mastered, we move more quickly through the curriculum. But we need to choose materials how do we do this? We choose materials at an appropriate with an appropriate instructional match. We provide brief, repeated practice opportunities with appropriate forms of assistance. We monitor students' performance and use performance goals for deciding when to change materials. Number 4, design interventions to ensure productive practice. So that's making sure that students have the accuracy in the materials, and we're providing them with sufficient amounts of practice so that they're able to gain fluency in it. We change the reinforcement contingencies sequentially over the course of the skills. So whenever we're building accuracy, we are reinforcing accuracy. Whenever we're trying to build fluency, we're reinforcing accuracy with fluency. Across the time, we can be thinning out our schedules of reinforcement. As behaviors become easier for kids to engage in, the amount of reinforcement they need to engage in those behaviors is not as much. So, but how do we make these decisions? It means we have to be collecting data at all times. We need to know where the kids' skills are. If we don't know where the kids' skills are, we cannot provide instruction on the correct material, and we cannot provide the appropriate type of reinforcement. So know and understand these tables, and if you don't, you should ask me further questions about it in class. All right, I'm going to stop this recording and then we will move on. I will be making another recording for you all.